Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Pamela Meyer, president of Meyer Agile Innovations. Pamela is a leading Agile innovation expert who works with leaders, teams, and organizations that need to be more agile and innovative to compete in a rapidly changing world, which is seemingly everybody these days. She is the author of 5 books on agility, innovation, and learning, including her newest book, Staying in the Game, Leading and Learning with Agility for a Dynamic Future, as well as her original book, The Agility Shift, Creating Agile and Effective Leaders, Teams, and Organizations. In this conversation, we touch on agility and the importance of agility, and we go deep into games and the games that we're playing, how to identify the games we're playing, how to understand whether we are playing the right games, how to be agile within those games, and how to create a mindset that keeps us in the games that bring us value and joy for a long time. I have been interested in the idea of thinking about our lives in games since I read the book Finite and Infinite Games many years ago. We touch on that a little bit in here, as well as a ton of other stuff. Very excited to share this one with all of you. I hope it helps you play the games that you are playing, whether that is an actual game or your career game or your relationship games. I hope you play that better because of this conversation. Here is Pamela Meyer. Pamela, welcome to the show. I am excited to have you on. You do not know this, but 3.5 years ago, I sat down and I wrote down a list of everyone I knew who I thought would be great to have on the show. And you were on that original spreadsheet because I've heard you speak before, and we know each other a little bit through the Chicago SHRM community. And I'm glad that while it didn't happen right away, that we've got you on the show. So excited for the conversation today. Welcome.
Thank you. Fantastic. And it's clearly this is the right timing. So I'm thrilled to be with you, O'Brien.
Life is all about timing. Want to get into a lot of the topic of your new book, Staying in the Game. But before we do that, I would love for you to just kind of introduce yourself and the work you do, because there is a lot that you do. And I just would be curious, how do you answer the question, what do you do?
Yeah, boy, that's an always evolving process. But I always lead with saying that I work with leaders and teams that want to be more agile and innovative. And then from there, a deeper dive into what that looks like. But it is everything from booster shot keynotes and workshops to longer consultancies. And of course, I'm an author and was a longtime faculty member at DePaul University, where I would work with adult students who were largely coming from the business world and were looking to refine their skills and up their credentials. So I always like to say I have a fairly diverse portfolio of work, but it really boils down to leadership development in all of its forms.
I love that. And the new book, Staying in the Game, we'll get into a lot of it, but why did you write this book? And when somebody asks you, what's this book about? What's your answer?
Yeah. Well, I wrote it because, interestingly, The Agility Shift was still going strong, and that was my last book. And I wasn't looking to write a new book, but what I noticed was after the initial wave of enthusiasm and organizations and leaders across sectors are embracing agility, they understand they need to be more agile. But one of the things I noticed was after that initial push, and even companies that are formally adopting agile methodologies, they started to drift back into their formal routines and their comfort zone. So I realized that there's this gap, not just how do we become more agile, but how do we sustain agility and our passion for leading and learning and adapting. And interestingly, at the very same time, I had gotten back into a passion from my youth, which was downhill skiing and specifically downhill racing. And when I got back into it after a few decade break, I was afraid I was going to be the oldest person out there. Am I going to be able to pick up on the new equipment, all of that. Turned out I was one of the youngest people, and I was out there with people in their 60s, 70s, even 80s who were still going strong. And that was what really sparked my curiosity about what does it take to still be out there competing, learning, striving to improve. And I discovered, boy, the answers to these questions after I started interviewing some of these fantastic masters racers can help answer the question that I'm working with many of my leaders and organizations that want to be more agile. So the book is really about the lessons learned and from interviewing some of the world's most agile leaders, and how can we as everyday leaders, emerging leaders, people working and collaborating on teams, put those concepts into practice so that we're always showing up and leading with agility at the top of our talent and supporting the success in any community we find ourselves in, but particularly in the business world.
Yeah, I love that. So the agility shift is how to create agility. Staying in the game is how to keep it for the long haul.
Yes, that's a great way to summarize it.
So you open Staying in the Game with a talk about games. And I think this is really interesting. And I've listened to some interesting podcasts other people have done on games. And it's easy to think, if you're an athlete, oh, my game is downhill skiing, or, in my case, my game is hockey. That's the one that I've played my whole life.
Right.
But a lot of people don't play sports as adults. And even if they do, there are plenty of other games that we are playing. So how do you help people, or how do you think about defining the games that people are playing and getting the head around what is a game? How should we think about our life in terms of games? And how do we know which games we're actually playing?
Yeah, this is such a great area of exploration. And what I saw in both interviewing top leaders who were consistently staying agile throughout their careers, as well as athletes. And by the way, those circles very often intersected. But that people, it isn't necessarily the games we play any playing field wherever we find ourselves, but I consistently found that it is whatever activity, interactions, ways of showing up that help us live into our purpose, our passion, and certainly give us an opportunity to play and experience pleasure. And so I call these the 4 Ps of the game. And we may not necessarily experience all of them all the time when we're playing, but if we can pay attention to experiences we're having or activities that we're engaged in when we feel like we're most aligned with those 4 Ps, then we've very likely landed on some core aspect of our game. And it's not so important if this game, I would say defining the game as a specific activity as much as paying attention to when we're experiencing those 4 Ps, and then very likely you're onto a core thread that we search for in as many interactions and activities as we can in our lives and work.
So what are the 4 Ps?
Yes, they're our purpose, our passion, our opportunity to play and experience pleasure. So those are the 4 Ps. And they, in a sense, another way for us to pay attention to if we're experiencing them is when we're feeling energized, when we're feeling most engaged. Very likely, at least a few of those Ps are playing out and being engaged. And what I found in my research is that for many people, that experience of being in their game, wherever they find themselves, becomes such a core part of who they are. In fact, I had a number of leaders say, it's simply who I am. I mean, I can't even separate what I do in this context from who I am. And that's how I landed on this core concept of our meaningful identity. That means that it's some aspect of my life and work that is so intrinsic that it contributes to how I make meaning in the world and how I create meaning in my life and work.
So let's piece this apart a little bit because I think this is interesting. The easiest game, I think, to think about is work, right? We're all doing a job. We all have career trajectories that we're on. And I think we can think about those as games. Would you agree that that's a game that we're playing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so there's a lot of people who may say, I don't really have purpose in my career, or yeah, it's great. I make money. It's fine. There's some pleasure here some of the time, but I'm not really, I wouldn't call it passion, and definitely wouldn't call it play.
Mm.
Does that mean we need to find a different game, or does that mean we need to think about the game we're playing differently?
Yeah. I mean, ideally, certainly both could be true. It might be that it's time, if you really have kicked all the tires, explored all of the opportunity, it might be time to start looking for another opportunity where we experience those higher levels of engagement. But it's certainly worth looking for ways that our current setting can give us more of that sense of engagement. And this is also the role that other leaders and team members can play in supporting that. But it's one of the roles that reflecting on other areas of our lives that we do experience it. Very likely, if we simply ask people to think about experiences they're currently having or have had at some point in their lives where they did experience or do experience that sense of purpose, passion, pleasure, and play, then we can usually come up with something. For you, it might be hockey or the work that you're currently doing, and then look for the transferable pieces. How can I bring a little more of that energy and enthusiasm into my day-to-day work? What's happening there that isn't really happening in this other setting that I'm not finding as engaging? And that's often a starting point. It might be that, you know what, I'm not learning as much anymore in my current workplace. And that's one of the things I find so engaging in this other setting. Or, I don't have as much of a sense of connection or interpersonal interaction in my current setting. And maybe I need to bring more of that in or find a way to deepen that.
Do you have an example maybe from your own life or somebody that you've worked with where you were able to identify something that was working in one area that wasn't working in another and find that thing again in the area where it wasn't working?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it's one of the common practices I'll use with teams. So it's not necessarily a specific example of a one-on-one transfer, but I'll tell you what I often do with teams is, especially a new team that's coming together or an organization that's in the midst of a merger or acquisition, when there are people from a lot of different settings coming together, I'll ask each individual to think about a time when they felt like they were really working at their best or engaged in a really productive and exciting, energizing collaboration, and to start thinking about what was happening, what were they doing, what were they thinking and feeling. Some of your listeners may be familiar with this as a common practice in appreciative inquiry. And then we'll get people interviewing each other and hearing more about these high energy experiences. And they could be a work setting. It could be something that happened in a volunteer setting. But then once they start sharing these stories, they start identifying the themes of when they're at their best. What are they experiencing at their best? And then making conscious choices to work together to live into those, to create environments and work practices that bring out the best in each other. So it's an intentional practice where we're sharing our own personal stories or our work stories, volunteer stories, and then bringing them to life and creating the current work environment. And that's a great way to re-enliven an existing team, a new team or group that's coming together from various points and to get unstuck or re-energized.
Yeah, that is great. One other thing about the 4 Ps that kind of struck me, and this, again, we talked about timing is everything. I had listened to another podcast episode of the Tim Ferriss show on happiness about a week or two ago. And it was interesting. The gentleman that was talking was a Harvard professor, and he was saying that most of us think that if we want to be happier, we have to be less unhappy. And he said that what was interesting is that happiness and unhappiness actually register in 2 different parts of the brain. Both can be high at the same time. So you can be in a phase of life or doing something that you don't enjoy, you can be sad about something, and you could also be experiencing happiness in some other area of your life or in that specific moment. The 4 Ps that you chose, play, purpose, passion, pleasure, they're all very positive.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure that you can attest as a competitive athlete and business person that there are times where you have to put your head down and go to work, and it is grueling and it is tough, and you think about quitting. And, in order to achieve some kind of success in whatever game you're playing, it takes hard work and there's some suffering involved.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm curious how you think about balancing those two sides, knowing that the 4 Ps are so important, but that if we want success, we also have to embrace the other side.
Yeah. And actually, I feel like they are totally compatible because, as an athlete, you know this, that we need to tap into the energy when the going gets tough. And actually, one of the core themes that I found in these masters athletes, as well as longtime effective leaders, is their level of commitment. And commitment means that they make it a priority. They make their continuous learning and development a priority. They talked to this 84-year-old master ski racer who said that, I asked him, why is it you keep getting out there when many of your colleagues just have stepped away? And he said, you know what? I'm tempted to. It's like 20 below out. My bed is warm. It's dark out. And I don't really want to get out there and, whether it's do my run or go out and train on the mountain. And he said, but I don't indulge that. I just get out there and do it. I do what I need to do to stay out there. And in that sense, commitment is prioritizing and in many ways sometimes reprioritizing as things change, the practices and the discipline that it takes to dig deep. And so I do write a bit about the difference between discipline and motivation and how important it is to create both, but to also to consistently prioritize the commitment, which in many ways is also that sense that I've identified something that does give me energy. It's so part of my identity that I'm not willing to let it go. And yet I know that it's going to take hard work to stay engaged in it. And that really is what separates longtime effective leaders from those who may peak or a few good years or a great project, but then get derailed or simply go back into their comfort zone over time. They lose track of that passion for continuous learning and development. They lose connection to the commitment because they're that sense of identity or that sense of purpose and passion has started to fade.
Yeah. Well, there's a good point there, and it's something I've struggled with, just like I think a lot of people struggle with, is most of us want to believe that there's an arrival point, that we put in the work and then we reap the reward and then we just keep reaping the reward. It's just not the way that life works. It's told to us through advertising. It's implied a lot of the time that if you get this thing, if you achieve this goal, if you accumulate these accolades, then you'll be happy, then you'll have a good life, then. And I like the story about your 82-year-old. Yeah, he could step off and decide that he's not going to. But if you want to stay in the game, if you want to keep playing, if you want to keep engaged, if you want to keep growing, you have to be willing to keep embracing the difficult side of life and the struggle of life. I remember realizing that in my 20s at some point, and just not that I didn't know it, but I remember realizing really specifically I'm going to have to keep doing this forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's defeating at first, but then it's empowering when you realize okay, this is, I gotta change my mindset here.
Yeah. And I think, well, you certainly don't have to be an athlete. There's so many practices that require ongoing engagement and discipline. Truly just being in the workplace requires that today, but it does help, I think, to have at some point come from a background that required essentially keeping up our fitness is the essence. And that fitness can be physical. It can be our learning and development fitness. But every athlete knows, you don't just do your 10-week training program and then you're done, you're set, you can chill out. I mean, it is a constant ongoing practice, and we always have to adapt, whether it's adapting for the sport or what's going on with our bodies at any given time. So that metaphor of fitness, I think, is a good one for us to realize that it's the same with any kind of success. It's not a set it and forget it. It's what do I need to do to stay fit for my workplace right now, for my current, what's happening in the marketplace, what's happening in my industry. Certainly AI is giving all of us a huge opportunity to do some more learning and to understand how we may need to adapt and respond. But it's always emerging technologies, a new player in our marketplace, all kinds of things that offer opportunities for learning and adaptation.
Yeah. There's a good point here as well, where you're talking about your 82-year-old friend, and he had said, I could give up and I could stay in my warm bed and I could not do the training, but he chooses to do that. At the same time, there are plenty of instances in life where it makes sense to move on. And, Annie Duke came out with a great book 2 years ago called Quit, and it's all about how to get out of the things when they're not serving you anymore. So how do you think about making the decision between, do I continue down this path and do I continue to embrace the struggle of this game versus it's time to give it up and find a new game?
Yeah. And this is really an important area that all of us, as we go through our careers and lives, need to be thinking about, because it's absolutely not a one and done. We choose our activity. This is it forever and ever. I mean, maybe there are a handful of people that are lucky enough to never experience a setback or a shift where that they can pursue something completely unfettered. But of course, there are going to be changes, and it can be things out of our control. I mean, I'm going through a recovery process from tearing an ACL this last season. So that's a physical setback that has required me to reevaluate. I'm lucky enough to be able to be pretty confident I can come back into a game that I love. And I have an entire chapter on risk assessment that gives everyone a chance, whether it's a business endeavor, a personal endeavor, to really think through, is the risk worth the reward? And so there may be a time when the current activity, whether it's a financial or personal or social emotional risk, is no longer worth taking. The reward isn't as fulfilling as it was. Or sometimes we simply discover, you know what, this just isn't as energizing for me anymore. Or the community has changed in a way that I don't really feel like it's aligned with my identity anymore. And I need to find another, whether it's a workplace or community group to engage in. So there are a number of times when we might be called to shift the game. It doesn't mean that we give up on experiencing purpose, passion, pleasure, and play. It means that we may need to start to look proactively for other experiences and opportunities for us to experience those. Ideally, they're aligned with what I reference as livelihood, that is both remunerative in some way and also fulfills those, but sometimes they are separate or there's just a little bit of overlap. But we don't lose sight of or commitment to finding those and keeping those in our lives. It just may need to shift at some point.
Well, it reminds me of Simon Sinek's Start With Why, and about how if you get defined on why you've made the decisions you've made, and if you look back and figure out where the common threads are through all the things that you've done, even if they're very different, then you can look forward again and design things that will bring you similar joy and fulfillment. Bring the 4 Ps. It'll be different, but the same, right? Like it'll be a different activity, but the same core values that you're tapping into, or the same types of meaning that you're getting. If you like teaching people and you like mentoring people, maybe at some point you're a little kid's coach, you're coaching a little kid's football team, and then you get a little bit older and maybe you're mentoring some people in your organization, and then maybe you teach at a college. And you can always kind of find ways to mentor people around you, even though maybe you have to give up whatever the exact version of that is that you love right now.
Yes, absolutely. And in my book, I write about a couple of leaders that made very similar shifts as you're describing, where they were very tapped into their core values and found that the work they were doing wasn't continuing to fulfill them to the same degree. And they made shifts to a new work opportunity, and in several cases made even bigger impact, though it was a risky move because their sense of self, identity, comfort zone was wrapped up in what they had been doing, even if it was no longer quite as engaging and felt quite as aligned as it was. But by taking that risk, they created even more value, even more impact. So it's a scary thing to do, but I think knowing that and seeing models for people who are making those shifts and more, I think in our current very dynamic context that all of us are living and working in, we should expect to be making those shifts. So it's an ongoing opportunity for us.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, to pivot a little bit, but you were kind of going here anyway, is you talk about your identity being really tied up into whatever the game is that you play. You know, there are a lot of people who make their income based on the game that they're playing, and that's either the only or the primary game that they play, and they wind up gripping the club really tight, and you actually lose agility, I think, where now you're afraid to take some kind of risk, or you're afraid to step out and do something else, or expose yourself in a way, and you see all kinds of weird behavior and people who just kind of lose the thread of the 4 Ps because maybe they liked it at one point, but now they're so afraid to lose it because it's the foundation of what they built their life on. So how do we continue to play a game that makes us money while also loosening our grip on it so that we can actually enjoy the 4 Ps while we're doing it?
And it's interesting. There was a few weeks ago a really great opinion piece in the New York Times that was all about the age of insecurity, and that we've created a society where people have become so afraid of what they might lose, you know, whether it's losing status, losing money, losing, you know, and then that can box us into things that are no longer fulfilling and energizing. And so one of the things I write about a bit is we need to hold our identities lightly. So while it's important to have clarity on what energizes us and what is meaningful for us and gives our life meaning, to not create a death grip on that or fall in love with the external trappings that come with that. Because just as you say, that can box us into something that ultimately becomes depleting, and maybe we start to live into a version of ourselves that we don't even recognize anymore because we're more motivated by some of the externals than that intrinsic reward that's coming. And so one of the things, especially, I mean, certainly I'm not diminishing how critical it is for all of us to have a livelihood that meets at the very least our basic needs and hopefully allows us to thrive, is for us to continue to pay attention. So hopefully we don't simply wake up one morning and discover that, you know, this isn't the life I wanted, but that we can start to, you know, with an embodied presence. And I talk a lot about embodied agile leadership. We identify those signs early on, and that we're always engaged in a way that we're looking for new trends and opportunities on the horizon, so that it's not simply stepping from one boat to another, but hopefully continuing to develop new skills, new interests, new curiosities, that when the timing is right, we're already kind of on that train. We're already morphing into that new opportunity. In some cases, that'll mean leaving behind what we were doing before. In other cases, it's actually bringing it with us and finding new ways to live into some of the skills, knowledge, and talent that we developed in other arenas.
So this is probably a good spot to more formally introduce agility. So what does it mean to be agile as a human being to you?
Yeah, so I describe it, and certainly in the agility shift, I go into the definition and dimensions in great detail. But in simple terms, I simply describe agility as our ability to learn and adapt in response to changes in the environment, and also our ability to quickly turn challenges into opportunities. So it's multidimensional, but at the core of it, as a leader, is our ability to consistently learn and adapt in the midst of change.
how does somebody self-assess their own agility at this point? Because I think we'd all like to think we're agile and yeah, sure, I like change and I'm okay. And reality is we're not. And, it's hard all the time. So what's a good self-evaluation for this, for somebody to be thinking about how it's showing up in their life?
Yeah, well, probably one of the best things is for us to simply think about a time recently when you experienced a big disruption or things didn't go as planned, and to think about, what was my first response? How did I walk through that? Was I able to fairly quickly adapt to the new reality and be effective, or did I get caught up? How did I tap my available resources? So to start thinking about that. And interestingly, I actually have developed something called the Agility Shift Inventory for people who want to formally assess their leadership agility. And that information is available on my website. But I think we can all subjectively think about situationally recent experiences of disruption and simply subjectively assess our own performance. And ideally hear from others who we worked with. How was it working with me through that change? Or can you give me some feedback about how I handled myself during this time, or how you experienced me as a leader during this time of disruption?
And where do we start in order to improve our agility? And I imagine, like anything, this is a spectrum and all of us can improve our ability to respond better to difficult situations in the world and overcome challenges more quickly. Where do we start so that we can begin to move in the right direction?
Yeah. Well, what I've discovered, and this is the core of the leadership work I do, that it starts and ends with our mindset, demeanor, our attitudes, our beliefs. And it's very interesting because so many leaders have, if we're thinking about traditional leaders, but I work with leaders at all levels and have a pretty broad definition of leadership, but people who've risen through the ranks in an organization, in many cases have built their credentials based on a planning and control mindset. And they've been expert at that. They've been expert at assessing and analyzing and creating and executing plans. Well, we're now in an age where there's some limited value in those core competencies because the future is so dynamic that the plans we make today very well will have very little to do with what's happening tomorrow or next week or a year from now. And so the core shift in mindset is one from planning and control to learning and adaptation, to really lean into our curiosity. And what I've seen with leaders that have made this mindset shift and live into it, not only are they leading with agility, but they're creating environments that inspire others too. And they're creating energizing environments for people where people are working at the top of their talent. They want to stay. They feel like they have opportunities to learn and grow. So there's a huge ripple effect with leaders that are shifting their way of thinking. And then that translates into how they show up, how they're working and collaborating with their colleagues.
One thing that I think about when we are talking about agility is actually something that I've been attributing to you. So I've been giving you credit for this. I think you said it in a presentation I heard 10 plus years ago. But you were talking about how full we keep our schedules and our activities in our lives. Yeah. And I believe the number you threw out was somewhere, it was either 85 or 90% is kind of the optimal capacity at any one time. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you might be talking even about the 20% rule that so many organizations, at least started with Google or IBM even, but creating time for free space for us to play with new ideas. And yeah, so typically 80% of our time focused more on our current role and the agreements we've already made and what we're currently working on and executing, but to create some space for experimentation and certainly new learning, but for us to play around with hunches. And this is a great time for us to be starting to think about new games, new areas that I want to play in that are sparking my interest and curiosity.
Yeah. And at the same time, though, like there was a line that you talked in the book, slow down to go fast. Mm-hmm. And I remember the Modern Family episode where they were all in a hurry. And I think it was Phil kept saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And that was kind of the mantra through the episode to get everybody where they needed to be. And I do believe in that I think one of the areas that when I get in trouble and I find myself overwhelmed, it's when I have booked myself with so many projects and to-dos and responsibilities that I have to just be going all the time. And I don't have time to slow down and think, what's the next priority here? How do I organize this? What really needs to happen? Am I even working on the right things? Like being able to have that little bit of reflective time to take a sense of what's going on and pivot and be agile, right? To react to what's happening is so important. And yet so many of us are over-programmed to the point that we're not doing that.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, anyone who's been in a rush to get out of the house and, gotten halfway to their destination and realized, they left their, laptop or some critical piece and realized rushing often doesn't serve us. So you're absolutely right. And it's the hardest in fact, in analyzing more than 1,000 respondents to the Agility Shift inventory, we found that time for reflection, it's the aspect of agility that is so critical and that most people struggle with, which is slowing down enough to learn the lessons from experience and apply those lessons going forward. And it is also the time for regeneration and renewal. So it's absolutely a critical time. And, it's interesting. We're so wired in Western culture. We're so action oriented, and business, of course, has a bias toward action, as it should. But we also, and those implementing Agile frameworks know that this is baked into the Agile methodology, is to include time for reflection, so that we're always pausing to see, so what did we learn from our last work cycle? What do we want to do differently? What obstacles do we want to remove to improve? But it's also a time, and certainly as someone who's recovering from an injury, I can say it's a time to step back and reevaluate our values or what got us to this point, and ultimately to come back and reengage even stronger and with greater intentionality. And people or organizations that don't take that time to slow down periodically, and even better to incorporate that into the way they do their work cycles, miss those opportunities and very often end up with high turnover of their top talent and burnout, and eventually finding that their fantastic strategic direction is no longer as relevant to the current marketplace because they didn't take the time to evaluate whether they were still in sync with what was happening in the current reality.
Yeah, that's a good point. You talk about reflection, and one of the things I wanted to ask you, can you talk about the 4 different types of reflection?
Yes, absolutely, because it is another chance to slow down to even understand what we mean by reflection. And I specifically talk about embodied reflection because we've typically think of reflection as only happening from the neck up, that it's purely a cognitive process. And I encourage people to take their whole bodies along because our bodies have a lot to tell us about what we're experiencing. So I refer to embodied reflection, but the 4 types are anticipatory, reflecting in action, reflecting on action, and vicarious reflection. And briefly, those are: anticipatory reflection is when we might be getting ready for something. It might be giving a speech or a big product launch, and starting to almost anticipate what will happen and what we're thinking and feeling. And sometimes our bodies have a lot to tell us about that. And that can inform by and through anticipation any shifts we need to make or anything more we need to do to get ready to be effective in anticipatory reflection. Reflecting in action is in the heat of the moment, that we have to not only, if we're executing a plan, to be able to take in new information and be able to adapt, I write about one of my favorite interviews in the book was a guy named Graham Smith, who's a ski coach, but he's also a retired fighter pilot. And he talked in detail about the kinds of adaptations. Of course, they have a mission, but they've got to, in a life or death situation, be able to adapt in the moment with high situational awareness, high embodied awareness. And it's something that can serve all of us well in our work lives too, to be willing to not have a death grip on the plan, but still be able to take in new information and adapt in the moment.
Yeah,
and
those
then
in-game adjustments.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Every athlete in a game situation knows, your opening strategy may not be the strategy that works, whether it's against your competitor or the current situation.
Yeah. It's Mike Tyson's everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I love that. Yep. And then reflecting on action might be the one that most people are familiar with. I mean, everything from the military version of after action reviews to agile methodology has retrospectives. We've all, taken the time to reflect. But again, that's a time to bring our whole bodies. How did we feel during that? When were we frustrated? When were we at our best? And take those lessons forward. And then another one that maybe gets the least amount of acknowledgement, but can be really helpful is vicarious reflection, which the good news is we don't always have to learn all the lessons firsthand, which is to reflect on other people's experience and even put ourselves in someone else's shoes and think about how would we have felt going through what they went through and learn those lessons from others. So those 4 types are really helpful, and we can slow down and be a little bit more intentional in practicing them and finding opportunities to be effective. So thanks for calling that out, because we can all slow down to go fast, whether it's, on our drive back and forth to our destination or a little bit of time at the beginning or end of the day. There's always the chance to learn some more lessons from experience.
Yeah, definitely. The more lessons we can learn from somebody else's experience, the better. So we don't have to suffer through it all ourselves.
Truly.
The inaction reflection is interesting too, because as I think back using the sports analogy, anytime you're in a new sport or you're playing a new game, that inaction reflection takes so much bandwidth to work. I think about when I started in my sales career, I would be in a sales presentation and I would constantly be thinking about what the next thing was that I had to say. And it took so much time to process what they were saying and reflect on how it was going. And you just wound up making a bunch of mistakes and you were not performing at your best. But over time, as you continue to do it, you gain more experience and that reflection becomes easier. And so, now I've been a salesperson long enough and I've been doing my specific job for 14 plus years that I can sit in a meeting and in real time usually think, okay, well, they just said this. I need to pivot here. I can react much better to what's happening mid-game. I can make mid-game adjustments. Oh, they actually don't want me to talk about this thing that I came prepared to talk about. So let's pivot over this way and now be more agile and talk about something completely different. Or in a game, this strategy isn't working. So rather than beat my head against the wall, not understanding it, I know that I've got a couple other strategies I can pivot to, or I can try to ad lib something. It's like, it's going to be clunky at first. And I think somebody who's been doing something without reflecting in game, this is going to slow you down. And I think we have to just acknowledge that and that's okay. And that's part of the process. That role plays, that's why role plays can be so powerful, or practice can be so powerful, because you get some of that clunkiness out before an actual game. And I think that applies as much to the working world as it does to sports.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've named so many really important things there. And actually, one of the things I identified in some earlier research I did was a common shift, and you described it beautifully, from self-consciousness to self-awareness. And the self-consciousness is so uncomfortable when we're always kind of processing, how am I doing and what are they thinking and what should I say next? But the self-awareness is different. It is that kind of embodied awareness where we've got a little more sense of our comfort in our own bodies, in the space. We can read what's happening in the room, whether it's real or virtual, and keep adapting. And it does take some practice and come with time. I always recommend literally people taking an improv class and getting, creating more opportunities, but role playing is great. And just putting yourself in more and more situations where you do have to learn and adapt in the moment. And one of the things I write about in the book is encouraging leaders to do what scares them. We do have a tendency to want to stay in our comfort zone, to maintain a certain outward appearance of competence and confidence. But the more we can get comfortable being uncomfortable and put ourselves in situations where we do have to stretch a little bit, then, the more we're going to, when we encounter another new unexpected situation, feel confident. Like, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I am confident that I can show up, I can respond and listen and adapt, and perhaps not have to have all the answers, but I can co-create those in real time with my colleagues, or allow those to emerge without forcing things or feeling like I'm going to get locked up here.
Yeah. I had this conversation with an intern that I'm working with right now just 2 days ago, where we were talking about the importance of leaning in when you are excited about something and also scared of that thing.
Yes.
Like, that is just such an indicator that there's some meaning or some big opportunity there.
I love that. And I encourage people for the very same thing. And in many ways, that's probably a great indicator that you might be on to an exciting new game, because games, part of why we love games, and some people may be put off by the idea of the game. What I encourage people is to let go of necessarily a set idea of what we mean by game, but this idea of something that is exciting and scary at the same time. Because what compels us to games is the same as what compels us with a really great drama. We don't know how it's going to end. We want to see how the story unfolds. And if we can be part of that and build our confidence along the way, then it's the best possible outcome.
Yeah. Well, and a great way if people are struggling with how to think about games is to pick up either the book, Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game.
Right.
That's a great one. But it's also, that one's actually based on another book called Finite and Infinite Games, which is not as
not as sexy, but
it's not as pop culture written as Simon Sinek's book. His is a little more accessible, but Finite and Infinite Games goes into more detail on the original kind of theory of games and the rules behind the different games. And if you can understand what type of game you're playing, you can understand what the rules are, and you can be more successful in that game. Yes. So we are all playing all kinds of games all the time. If you don't think you are, you don't understand the games that you're in, and you're probably losing. So I would encourage people who are interested in this topic of games, after they've read your book, of course, to go out and check out one of those too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, this sense of the game that doesn't necessarily have an end, with the idea of the infinite game, but that is compelling to us because the playing itself has an intrinsic reward. And I would say that was one of the big headlines I discovered with leaders that truly are staying in the game, is that they've tapped into an intrinsic motivation that is so rewarding and compelling, and continues to provide new opportunities for learning and growth, that they keep coming back to it. And one of the things that I saw again and again, and this is from, being out there on the race hill, no matter the age of the racer, they come through that finish line and then they pause. Once they've seen their time, they pause, they look back up the hill and they think, on that fourth gate, I was a little late on my turn and that threw off. And every single racer, I swear, no matter their age, thinks they haven't had their best run and they want to get back up there and do it again. And that's what, finding your game is about. It's something that, that was great, but I want to do it again because I know I can do better. I know there's more to learn. I know I can show up even stronger. So I really encourage people to think about, what is it that they find so intrinsically engaging that they want to keep exploring it. They're still curious about it. They want to find how they can show up at their best and continue to deliver or generate value for themselves and others.
Pamela, I think there's probably another half page of questions that I had for you, but I think that might have to save for another day. I do have one more question for you, and this is one that I ask most of my guests at the end of this. With everything that we're talking about around finding your game and playing your game, what in your mind is the purpose of business?
Yeah, I love that question. And it did get me thinking, quite honestly, to think about, for me, the purpose of business is honestly to generate value and to generate value for our stakeholders. And I really have embraced this idea of, some people call it stakeholder capitalism. It's really the antidote to Milton Friedman's approach of the only purpose of business is to generate value for the shareholders. If we're really thinking about staying in the game long term, business has to generate value for all of the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And for me, that also resonates with staying in the game, because if we're generating value, then we're creating something that is compelling and that we want to stay involved in. We see the impact of what we're doing and we want to do more. And ideally, it aligns with our own energizing game.
I love that. And that ties back so well to everything you're about when it comes to agility, because if you are going to stay in the game long term, you have to be willing to adapt.
Yes, so true. Well, thank you, O'Brien. What a delightful, energizing conversation.
Pamela, this is fantastic. And to everybody out there, thank you. I hope this is helpful. All the best as you stay in the games that you're playing.
Thank you.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.